All right. Welcome. We're going to do this without music. Welcome to the Sons of Thunder.
That's taking me back, man. That is taking me back to your old DJ days.
My old DJ days.
DJ right? Mamu D will make
you
feel nice.
Thank you for that. I of course don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. Proceed.
I didn't used to use a free program with that came with our computer to make super awesome DJ beats in 2001.
And songs about world domination, nation.
Man, you're taking people down a rabbit trail of inside jokes they are never going to understand. This is the Sons of Thunder, and I've already got several people watching. If you're listening later on via the podcast, or if you're watching this video on Facebook or YouTube later on, let me just encourage you to, if you're watching on Facebook, like this video and follow what we're doing with the Think Institute. If you're watching on YouTube, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, pass this around on Twitter.
Leave a crazy comment if you're on YouTube, because you guys are insane.
Dude, seriously, if you're watching on YouTube, what is wrong? To quote R.C. Sproul, what is wrong with you people?
Exactly.
Because you're all of you. I don't even think we need to qualify. You're all insane.
Yeah.
Every time a video goes up there, it's like the crazies come out and feel the need to just proffer their conspiratorial
just lunacy.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for listening. I'm Joel Settecase.
And I'm Parker Settecase.
And this is the Sons of Thunder, the show where mostly it's us bloviating about philosophical topics, but every now and then we do get a real scholar to come on and talk about something that's really fascinating. And we've got that today. So I want you to just imagine the scenario. Okay. Imagine that you are the father of, or mother of a junior high student who comes home and says, "Hey, Dad, or you ask him, "Hey, what'd you learn in school today?" "Oh, not much. Our history teacher just taught us about Galileo and how the church persecuted Galileo for his scientific theories. And Dad, isn't it crazy? Isn't it crazy how the church has been such an enemy of science, over the years? And Dad, isn't that, that's pretty bad about the church, huh?" And then the kid goes to his room,
after a thorough spanking and no dessert.
That's right. We don't ask those kind of questions in this house, son. Listen, what do you say? What do you say when your son brings that to you, when your daughter brings that to you? And says, why is the church such an enemy of science?
Yeah. Well, I know what I would say. I would say, the world's in his hands, and I'd give them a Christian account of scientific laws and its antithetical competitors. That's what I would do.
It's funny you mentioned that, Park. What a coincidence, because there's someone who's actually done exactly that.
Wow.
Yeah. His name is Dr. Christopher Lee Bolt, and he's a husband, father, pastor, professor, and author of a book that is coincidentally titled "The World in His Hands: A Christian Account of Scientific Law and Its Antithetical Competitors." So without any further bloviating on our parts, I'm going to see how many times I can work that word in.
That's a good word.
Let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Chris Bolt to the show. Dr. Bolt, welcome to the Sons of Thunder.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is our pleasure, man. Parker suggested that we have you on. This is like over a month ago. Actually, before he even, I think, suggested that, he's like, "Hey, you got to listen to this interview with Eli Ayala, who we've had on on our podcast before as well." He's like, "You got to listen to this interview that Eli did with Chris Bolt, or CL Bolt, talking about presuppositional apologetics." So, and that sort of started this chain reaction of talking about getting you on the show. And so, I've been reading your book, and I must confess, man, I did not finish it. I'm about 48% of the way through, which, is probably more like 60% of the way through, because I think most of your book is probably endnotes.
That's right.
You've got some of the most extensive endnotes, and I know this is a doctoral.
Footnotes.
No, I think they're not. Are they footnotes or endnotes? Chris, can you help us with this? Are
Well,
they footnotes?
end notes are the devil, so they are footnotes.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It's in
Okay.
the foot of the paper.
Okay, well, on my Kindle version, they show up at the end of the.
Oh man, you don't get to see you don't get to see a full page of footnote.
That's theological downgrade right there.
That is. Hey, it's funny you mentioned theological downgrade because I know you are a graduate. Should I go there? I know you're a graduate of Southern Seminary, and I know you've been following what's been going on there. I don't know if we'll get to it today, but there's a lot going on in the world of Southern Baptists. Chris, are you? Sorry, should I call you Chris or Dr.
That's
Bolt?
fine. That's
is that
fine.
okay? Okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. So Chris, are you a Southern Baptist?
I am.
Okay,
Yes.
and you are a Southern Baptist pastor, correct?
I am. Yes.
And what is your? Are you the lead pastor? I know Southern Baptist, they've got pastors
Yes. So
and deacons.
my
most of the
title is pastor teacher, and we
Okay.
do have a plurality of elders, but we are congregational ruled.
Huh.
like good Southern Baptists, right?
Exactly.
Yes. But you have pastors and elders. Okay, so you're a graduate of Southern, you are a pastor, and you are in Western Middle Tennessee, correct? Did I get that right?
Southern Middle Tennessee. That's right. That's right.
Southern Middle Tennessee. Okay. And
I don't know it any better than you do. I feel new here too. But that's how they say it.
Well, where are you from originally?
Originally, I am from Lynchburg, Virginia.
Oh, okay. Virginia.
I hear
And-
it. I hear it in the accent there. It's nice.
Well, who knows what my accent sounds like now? Of course, I was in Louisville for 4 years, and then down in the South for a while now.
We got the Louisville pronunciation down. It's
Wait,
not
exactly.
it's not Louisville.
This
I don't
is
know if you know
also
that,
a matter of theological conservatism.
That's right.
Louisville.
Did you say you were in Louisville, or
Louisville. Come on, dude.
But look, I'm a Chicagoan. I'd say Louisville. Are you saying that you were in Louisville, but now you're in the South? In other words, implying Louisville is not the South? Is that?
Yeah, Louisville is the strangest place. I don't think that they're north, south, east, or west. They don't really know what they are.
Huh.
So,
Well, maybe that's part of the problem.
that could be. That
Yeah.
could be.
For
Maybe
us, anything south of Chicago is the South.
Right.
Anything south of I-80, which is about, let's say, 15 miles south of Chicago.
That's right.
We just sort of lump that all together.
Well, see, where I am now, they actually consider Lynchburg, Virginia, the north.
Wow.
Oh man.
So
Southerners are very interesting people. I love them. I love Southerners, but they're different. It's just
this is
different world down there.
the culture here is distinctly different from where I am from. But I grew up with a lot of New Englanders as well, so that may have
Okay.
something to do with it.
Well, then I've only got one question for you. How did you become a Chris Cornell fan? How did that happen?
I don't know if I'm comfortable with that being public knowledge or not.
Hey, you're the one who posted Chris Cornell
did.
lyrics on
I
Twitter,
did.
and I did my homework.
It was late at night, and that was probably ill-advised.
Feeling weak, yeah.
But I do love the lyrics to that. I thought those were brilliant lyrics.
Okay, so now,
But I am a big fan of grunge music. Yes.
so do you have an opinion on this? Would you say that Chris Cornell is objectively his James Bond theme for Casino Royale, is that the objectively best James Bond theme, or do you have no opinion on that?
Yeah. See, I'm not a James Bond fan or person, so
Okay.
I know almost nothing of that world. But I do like that song for sure.
Oh, okay. Well, that tells you something. Even non-James Bond fans like it. So that I'm gonna take that as a win. So you are a husband and father, correct? How many
Yes.
kids do you have, Chris?
4.
4 kids. Good for you, man. That's awesome. So of the three of us on this episode, on this recording right now, 2 of us are real men and have 4 kids,
Yeah.
and then one of us is
Waiting on the Lord's provision and taking his time to pray through decisions. Yeah.
That's
I
good.
understand.
That's good and spiritual. So, you're a pastor, you're a husband, you're a father, and you are the author of the world in his hands. But you also started a ministry or an organization called Choosing Hats. You
That's right.
co-founded that.
That's right.
And that was about 10, 11 years ago now. I understand that you're not still at the helm of that, but what is Choosing Hats, and how did that come about?
So choosing hats comes from a quote from Cornelius Van Til, who is considered the father of modern presuppositional apologetic methodology. And he said that one cannot simply choose epistemologies as one chooses hats. And so we had floated the idea of several different names for a blog, and we thought, how about choosing hats? And it stuck. Brian Knapp and I founded that website, and basically we had bumped into one another online and started talking to one another, and we were thinking right along the same lines on everything. It's like we could complete one another's sentences, even though we had never met. And so we just said, why not start a website? And our idea was to make presuppositional apologetics accessible just to virtually anyone, because there's often that complaint out there that a lot of presuppositional literature is difficult to understand. It's not accessible. So what we really wanted to do was to lose the terminology, to lose some of the academic erudition, and bring it down to just regular words for regular people. And I think we were successful in our goal. We had a really good run. When I began to pastor, that's when I did make kind of a set decision to not write as much, to focus in on that ministry more. And so the site's still up, everything's still there as of right now, but it's pretty much defunct. I might go and write something once in a while. But that's kind of the story of Choosing Hats, and it was a good run. Brian is trying to start some new things up. He's got a website now, Revelationary Apologetics, that he's trying to get going. And recently here, I've been invited onto more podcasts and whatnot. So that seems to be the new thing. It's interesting to see how the landscape has kind of changed in the past 10 years. So.
Yeah, I discovered Choosing Hats because I posted that quote from Van Til. I think it's from Survey of Christian Epistemology. And whoever was on Twitter under that handle at the time, liked it and was, I don't know, sent some kind of funny emoji. It's like, oh man, Choosing Hats, that's awesome. And then I went to the website and almost lost my mind just seeing all these resources. And I was like, I'm not alone. You know, I'm here in Chicago, so outside of the Westminster world, and was me and Joel were the only presuppers around that I knew of. And so then seeing all these resources on Choosing Hats was insane. It was awesome.
And you are committed to the presuppositional method. I know that, and I just want to recommend anyone listening or watching, after you're done watching this, and after you've subscribed and liked and shared it around, go ahead and seriously watch Chris's interview on Revealed Apologetics with Eli Ayala. It's very, very good. And he really lays out why presuppositionalism makes good sense, why that's his methodology, and his sort of unique way of approaching it. So how did you come to write this book, The World in His Hands? What was this was your doctoral thesis, but what led you in this direction?
Yes. So early on, I was getting into presuppositional apologetics and trying to comprehend what they were or what it is. And one of the things that kept coming up in the literature was, this needs a lot of work. This needs some development. We need to do things to move this method forward. And another thing that came up quite often was the complaint that there were not a lot of presuppositionalists who had gone through the academy and who carried the academic credentials and whatnot. That's not the case now, I don't believe, by any stretch of the imagination, actually. But I determined to do both of those things, to advance the method insofar as I could, and also to try to pursue something in higher education, to better understand the method and to apply it and use it and write about it and whatnot. So one of the things that became fascinating to me was Hume's problem of induction. And this refers to the Scottish skeptic David Hume. He was a radical empiricist, and the way I read Hume, his radical empiricism actually led him to skepticism. And so I view that as a failed epistemology of sorts that's illustrated in David Hume. And so David Hume was a figure I encountered in my undergraduate studies at it wasn't secular technically, but it was a secular undergraduate school. And I'm not talking about Liberty University, just so that you don't get hate mail on that.
Good clarification.
But anyway, we learned about David Hume. We learned about Hume's problem of induction. And so I determined to begin to study that problem. And of course, I'd heard it referenced in some of Bonson's material and whatnot, Greg Bonson's material, who was the protege of Van Til, of course. And so after taking really what I would refer to as a short break while I was in seminary studying for the ministry and the pastorate, I kind of let all that set to the side, but then I returned to that question in my doctoral studies and began to look more into these issues of the intersection of, in the broadest terms, religion and science, right? But perhaps in the narrowest terms, how do we respond to this problem of induction, utilizing what I know from the presuppositional methodology, but also drawing on, because, and a lot of people don't realize this, but where I went to school, Southern Seminary, was not committed to the presuppositional methodology, at least in its philosophy and apologetics departments. And there are many in the theology department who follow that course more so. So this book really comes out more as a cumulative approach. I'm drawing from different traditions of apologetics, but I think there's a lot to be said for that anyway, even from a presuppositional standpoint.
Yeah. I love in the introduction you say, thus this book is best viewed as a work of constructive philosophical theology with possible apologetic applications. And I love that because you're going downstream of the apologetics. And so it is a work of apologetics. You can apply this to apologetics, but it's more foundational, and it's a work of philosophical theology, which is awesome. And I was looking over. I think I found your dissertation online as well. And was Wellum your first reader, or I saw him on the board?
So Steve Wellum was on my defense committee.
Okay.
And James Anderson at Reformed Theological Seminary. He was my external reader.
What a lineup!
Yeah. It's fantastic. So getting into the book a little bit, this is awesome, man. I love this. I can't say enough good things. I haven't finished it either, like Joel, but I'm going to be working.
I've never read it, so
that's good.
It's really good. It's good.
Yeah,
what we've read so far.
I'll have to check it out.
We're gonna be making you quote stuff here. So Providence. This is another reason that I love it as a work of philosophical theology, because you are using actual Reformed theology in order to undergird science and the philosophy of science, which is huge. Usually hear from a lot of Christian apologists that, we have to have philosophy undergirding our theology. And I'm not sure what you'd say about this, but it's reciprocal. We need to have both. But here, you're taking this classical doctrine of providence, and then you're analyzing it. And I love that. I was hoping you could give us a distinction. So when you in your analysis of providence, you talk about governance and concurrence, and what's the third one here? Preservation. That's right. Can you explain to us how you're using those three, and maybe a quick definition?
Yes, let's see what I can remember. So in traditional Reformed thought, let's back up a moment. Just in general, there are kind of three different ways we could approach this topic of God's relation to the world regarding his providence and whatnot. And I use that word relation very loosely because that's a rabbit trail I don't want to go down. But I break this into three different approaches. There is a non-concurrent theistic preservation and government. And what I'm talking about there is simply, if you can think of an emphasis on the theistic element of providence apart from the cosmological element. In other words, we're thinking here of God as the first cause of everything, the primary cause of everything, with a denial of secondary causation or secondary causality. So in a view like this, if you were to drop a pin, there is, at least what I argue, is that there's really no scientific or causal explanation for this apart from God caused this to happen. God caused the pen to be suspended by the fingers in the air. God caused the pen to fall through the air. God caused the fingers to open without regard to I opened my fingers and gravity, right, affected this pen in such a way that it fell. This was a view that it seems to have been held by Jonathan Edwards. And I go into his view and interact with him, which that was a rather daunting task, by the way.
Yeah.
When I discovered the view that he held and
Yeah.
trying to sift through his works, I'm not that familiar with Edwards, trying to sift through his works to find where he talks about this and to interact with him on the front end of this work, I was thinking, what have I gotten myself into? But that's one view. Another view is the non-concurrent cosmological preservation and government. That's simply a deistic or a naturalistic understanding of how the world functions, how the world works. And I use kind of a simple cosmological argument that I pull, I believe, from Hugh McCann to rebut that view. Just to push back against that. By the way, on the first view, you're looking at Hodge, who is at Princeton, responding to Edwards on many of his issues, I believe, on that.
Mhm.
So the view I take is the concurrent theistic cosmological preservation and government. This means that God is at work in this task of preserving and governing the world, but that doesn't leave out secondary causation. That doesn't leave out the cosmological element here. And so you'll have one event, but you'll have two agents, as it were. So this then takes us into the different reformed views and understandings of that. You've got three parts usually understood in providence. There's concurrence, which is God working with the creation, as I've just explained. You've got preservation, which is God holding all things in existence, okay, and carrying them along. And then there's government, where they are governed toward their ends. I actually side with Francis Turretin and Oliver Crisp in the book in taking concurrence to be a function of God's preservation and government of the universe. Now, that's a minority view, but it just made better sense to me. I don't think that you have to necessarily commit yourself to that for the project of the book to still work.
Yeah. Well, real quick, sorry, Joel.
No, go ahead.
I saw that and it was funny. You go, yeah, no, I also conflate that. Chris conflates these two or says they're conflated. I also do that. And so I saw later that you did have this positive role for concurrence. And so I was just wondering, when you're relating concurrence to governance and preservation, is it like a more foundational? Is it holding up the other two, or is it like an emergent coming from the other two? I don't know if you thought through that, but.
No, I think I just want to say that that this is what providence is. It's God's concurrent activity.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Do you relate those three at all to sort of like a John Framian triperspectival scheme or anything like that? Do you see them as being tied to the Trinity at all, Chris? Or
I suspect that one could, and I read a lot of Frame early on in my studies and whatnot, not with regard to this. Mm-hmm. So I may be influenced by that. I don't know, but I'm sure you could approach it that way.
Okay.
The Framian triads run deep in our family.
Yeah, we're we're big frame guys.
So when I taught Christian ethics, I used John Frame's Doctrine of the Christian Life, and what we would do is my students would read each of the sections on the Ten Commandments and their application and whatnot, which I really enjoy the way the Frame approaches that. And then in class during the lectures and the question and answer time, I would teach the theory, the ethical theory, the meta-ethical theory and whatnot. And of course, he uses the triads and the triperspectivalism and all of that. And it was interesting because I had a student who was taking both world religions with me and that class concurrently. There's that word again. and the ethics class opened his eyes to everything he had learned in courses with me prior to that, right? So suddenly he saw, oh, this all fits together. You're saying this in every one of your courses, you know,
Yep.
because there was a clear Van Tillian thread that ran through that.
Totally.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, so Chris, what I'd love to do is to transition from what we've just talked about to sort of the practical meat of talking about the preconditions of science, natural laws, induction. How does how does science rely or best comport with the biblical worldview? And so there's so many questions bound up with this. Why doesn't science conflict with Christianity? Why is Christianity actually the best explanation for the preconditions of science, like the principle of induction? What is induction? How do natural laws all factor into this? And so if you could just
teach us a course real quick.
Just teach us a doctoral level course on the relationship between science and Christianity. And the reason why I really want to get here is because I've got interactions with skeptics and atheists who will just boldly just say, well, the church has opposed science at every turn. And, it's well documented that, or it's purely coincidental that the scientific revolution happened in the Christian world and things like that. And I would love to just hear you articulate your view on that and give myself and other Christians listening some red meat to use in those kind of conversations.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different ways that people may try to propose some type of conflict between science, whatever that is, and religion, whatever that is, or the Christian worldview, whatever that is. This is the philosophical training at work, right? But I mean, there are any number of different ways that people might approach that, probably on a street level, right? So what many of us will deal with are simply these claims that because God is not some empirical entity by our own admission, right? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. So he's not something or someone that we can empirically study the way that you might empirically study something else. This is something that Greg Bahnsen points out in his debate with Gordon Stein, that famous debate, the great debate. He calls this the crackers in the pantry fallacy. If you want to discover whether or not there are crackers in the pantry, you go to the pantry, you open the door, and you look with your eyes to see whether or not there are crackers in the pantry. And if you're a man, you won't see the crackers in the pantry. And if you're a woman, you will find them. No, but
especially if you use them. Yeah, man.
That hit way too close to home, Chris.
I know. I'm just, this is confession's good for the soul. But anyway, but Bahnsen is making the point there that all questions are not answered in exactly the same way. Looking for God or trying to figure out whether or not there's a God and this sort of thing is not the same as trying to figure out whether or not there are crackers in the pantry. And then that gets into, if you want to put this into a more of a classical apologetic methodology, you're simply talking about the refutation of naturalism, of metaphysical naturalism, which is at least the view that there is no God. You can get into different varieties of this. You have materialist views where matter, which are things that are extended in, it's something that's extended in space. Matter is the only thing that exists. Well, that's a very difficult claim to prove. In fact, I would say that that's an impossible claim to prove. And then you can appeal to various law-like realities, for instance, to rebut that claim using logic, for example. In my general apologetics course, we don't now, but we used to go through J.P. Moreland's Scaling the Secular City. And he offers an argument using logic and talking about the nature of logic to push back against metaphysical naturalism, a materialist view. So anyway, that's one of the concerns you might come across from an atheist or skeptic, an unbeliever, is that God is not empirically verifiable. You'd have to go down the philosophical road then of saying, well, there are many things that we believe in that are not empirically discerned, right?
Mhm.
And by empirical, I mean using our five senses. There are lots of things. Go ahead.
Like the claim that all knowledge comes through our five senses.
Exactly.
For example.
Exactly. And, that brings to mind how Habermas dealt with this. Gary Habermas, early on in my learning, I was reading him, and he said, if someone says, well, science is the only route to knowledge, that's self-refuting. You cannot test that claim in terms of a scientific methodology itself. And then he raised it again. He said, what about the idea that science is the best route to knowledge? And he says, no, this does the same thing, right? There's no way to test that empirically. I just saw a note come up there on the screen, by the way, as Chris's camera broke in. So here's the explanation on that. My camera is often down the way that the shake machine at McDonald's is down.
Oh,
but
solid
anyway.
analogy. By the way, I've been putting up comments as we've been talking. You have some serious trolls. I mean, this is some top shelf level trolling that's going on. So, some of the stuff I can't even tell. You got people calling you a coward for not having your camera up. So I'm like, are these people serious? Like, what's up with the hatred?
If they're calling me coward, that's my closest group of friends there.
Okay.
So hey guys, thanks for tuning in.
They're calling you a liberal, a coward. And I'm putting them up, and as I'm putting them up, Chris, I'm like, I'm sure these guys are joking, but wait, what if they're not? I'm like, I'm fueling the hate.
Yeah.
Poe's law, right? It's Poe's law. You don't know. Sometimes I don't know, but no, I have a good feeling I know where most of those are coming from.
Okay, good.
So that's one complaint. Another complaint would be, and this is the route I'm going to go down because we could talk about this for a long time, right? The supposed conflict between religion and science. Alvin Plantinga does a great job of addressing just what these different complaints are in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Religion and Science, or Science and Religion, Where the Conflict Really Lies. It's a yellow book for those who think of books the way I do. It's just a yellow book. Anyway. Another area there is. Yeah. Another area clearly is, and by the way, that does relate to this book. I'll mention that in just a moment. But another area this could happen is, of course, with macroevolutionary Darwinian biology and creationism and intelligent design. What's going on with the relation between those, that sort of thing. That's often where you see some pushback as well from those who think there's a conflict there. Plantinga does a good job of showing why these things are not in conflict, even if you don't agree with all of Plantinga's views. That's one of the great things about him, is he just makes enough wiggle room for anyone by appealing to possibility.
Right.
But the way that I address the supposed conflict in my book is I go the cultural route. And I refer to this as cultural apologetics. That term has different meanings depending on who you're talking to and what we're talking about. But what I mean by it with regard to my book is simply this idea that if Christianity is true, if Christianity is a good thing, then we should see some of that in terms of fruits in the world. And so we're looking at the type of work that's done, for example, by Nancy Pearcey. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. That might be Percy. I think it's Pearcey. Some of the work that's been done by others to point out that, no, it's not really the case that Christianity is in conflict with science. It's actually the case, historically speaking. When you go back, you can look and see that Christianity, Christianized cultures, which is a whole other question, but Christianized cultures are what give birth to science, modern science and technology and this sort of thing. So I explore that question at length in my book, even contrasting it then with societies that are more affected by atheism, which you're not going to find that, because that's always just a terribly minority view, right?
Hmm.
But then also Islam is the big one, looking at how Islam has historically related to science. And there are different reasons that you could point to as to why science did not do well in, say, an Islamic context. There are lots of different reasons we could point to, right? As far as the way that their civil government is set up, all of that. But what I go after in my book is how these different religions, so secularism or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, and I would have loved to have gone into more of these, but I couldn't for different reasons. Um, but I look at those and I say they have a bad understanding of the relation of their deities to the world.
You really do, Chris. I loved this about your book is you really pull no punches when you're dealing, even so you deal as far as what I've read so far, you deal with naturalism, Buddhism, which man, talk about trying to nail Jello to the wall. Try to define Buddhism and sort of like core beliefs that hold throughout all the different sects of Buddhism. But then you even go after Islam, which in many ways is the top non-biblical competitor to Christianity in terms of worldview. And what you do is you actually explain how not only is there conflict within the Islamic worldview where their view of God doesn't comport with science, but you actually demonstrate historically how all of their purported claims, where you'll have Muslim apologists talk about the great scientific accomplishments during the golden age of Islam and things like that, really, there really were none, or if there were any, they were very minimal. And most of the advancements that they made were in terms of mathematics and general knowledge, not in terms of actual scientific theory or scientific inquiry. And I really appreciated that because I do have some interactions periodically with Muslims, and I think that's a point that needs to be made.
Yeah.
And I think Parker would agree. I don't think that point is made enough.
No, and by Christian apologists as well, right? It's the big Abrahamic religions. We can make sense of this. We're all kind of on board against atheism, and then later maybe we'll talk against Islam, and
I tried to be, and people may not believe this, but I genuinely tried to be fair in that area of my studies. And what would happen, I'm digging through the library looking for primary sources and primary source material in Islam and looking at their philosophers and all of these different things. And, I would find something. Oh, here's one thing that we can credit to the golden age of Islam and this sort of thing. And oftentimes I would get a note back from my advisor who had studied Islam for years in depth. And I'd get a note back and he'd say, no, this one's wrong. This was actually discovered by so-and-so. And I kept thinking, well, what credit can I give them? And there is a name for this that I found in some of the literature, and it's the conveyor belt theory. We did pull a lot out of Muslim cultures, but it was in terms of what they had preserved through translation into Arabic that was later discovered in the Byzantine Empire and whatnot. Now, I'm not saying that's the sole source of our knowledge and that sort of thing. I can hear some defenders of the classic tradition getting upset with me in saying that. I'm not saying that's the sole source and all of that. But what I am saying is when we find contributions from Islamic civilization to the scientific endeavor and technologies and whatnot, it's very, very limited, and it's typically borrowed from another culture, preserved through Arabic and through the Muslim culture, and then passed on elsewhere. So, and there are very good reasons for that, I believe.
But you also make the point too that even when the record shows that Islamic scholars translated ancient texts, let's say Greek texts, into Arabic, and then from there, those texts were given to, they found their way over to Europe and were instrumental, later on in Europe during the scientific revolution and things like that. You even make the point that even that doesn't really add a lot to the scientific endeavor or revolution, because the Greeks weren't any more scientific anyway. It's not like you look at Aristotle's. I was always taught that Aristotle was sort of the first scientist, but you actually make the point that really even classical and ancient Greek thought didn't add really much at all to what we now consider to be modern science. So that really doesn't help out the Islamic claim that they sort of spurred on the scientific revolution either, does it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have these when you have these many various entities and deities that are running the show, that doesn't give you a very good basis for uniformity or regularity or predictability with regard to the contingent realm, right? And so even in Platonism, classically understood, you've got this world of the forms and ideals and all of that, but the issue for Plato is always, how do you bring those into correspondence with the contingent realm, right? What's the meeting point? Is it the human soul? Well, what does that look like? And then, of course, by the time Plato is discovering some of these difficulties, Aristotle comes along and completely undoes he doesn't completely undo it. I know he's building off him, but still, he goes against his professor, right? This is a time-honored tradition. You turn on your mentor, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and there's something else behind that as well. And I hope this didn't presuppositionally blind me to the project or something. I was reading these in other works and these objections to the Greek thought, but there's often this idea that, here we are on the fast track to postmodernity, whatever that is again, right? We are actually seeing, I think, the fruits of a really bad view that was taught in some corners of the academy. That view has hit the populace now. I mean, it is our pop culture. We're surrounded, we're swimming in postmodernity. And I mean, just look around. Everything we're going through right now seems to be as a result of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so the warning for years from Christian apologists in particular was to watch out for this thing. And some said, oh, it's nothing to be worried about. It's just this thing that's held in some corners of the academy. It's laughable. Well, it's not laughable to those who aren't trained in philosophy, who aren't trained in the academy. If it feels good, do it is pretty consistent with a fallen, sinful human nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty popular program for approaching life. Anyway, the temptation is to say, well, let's get back to the Greeks. Let's get back to the cradle of Western civilization. That will take care of all of this. And I would say no, because Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and, Greek mythology, these things are not Christian.
Right.
We're not looking at it. I hate to say this, but I'm going to. It's similar to what I see going on when you get into the debates between conservative theology and liberal theology. Well, for one thing, these are very closely associated with political terms, right? Conservative and liberal. And it's not always an instance of conservative versus liberal. It's simply, does this comport with Scripture or not? Is this what God has said or not? The Pharisees looked very conservative to me, but they were liberal. they were creating their entire system of religion on the basis of something other than this is what God has said.
Right.
And so we want to get back not to the Greeks, not to the modernists, not to the postmodernists. We want to get back to the Bible. That should be like a show or something, huh?
Yeah. You know what is so fascinating about this is there is this that desire to go back to the Greeks. I mean, there's a very Renaissance kind of feel about that, ad fontes, go back to the original sources. It reminds me of this interview I heard recently on the Unbelievable podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Great podcast. I had Justin Brierley on the Think podcast a while ago.
And there it is. There's all set up for the name drop.
Listen, now I can say, later on, I'm going to say, this reminds me of when we interviewed Chris Bolt. Yes.
Yeah.
But he had this historian, Tom Holland, on no relation to the Spider-Man actor, I don't think. But he talked about how he was disabused of this misconception that he had that American and Western civilization sort of finds its best historical analogy and root in the ancient Roman world. When in reality, when he went back and looked and he would read about Caesar and what was considered virtue, what he realized is I'm not Roman at all in my thinking. In fact, I've got a lot more in common with the Apostle Paul in my thinking in terms of morality and what makes a good civilization than I do in Caesar. And so I hear echoes of that in what you're saying, that we don't need to go back to the ancient Greeks if we want to return to a well-ordered thought life or scientific way of thinking. Really, we need to go back to the Christians who launched the scientific revolution. We have a lot. You might. I wonder if you'd agree with this. Does Neil deGrasse Tyson have a lot more in common with like a Copernicus or Newton than he does with like an Aristotle? I'm throwing those out there, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm really not that familiar with him other than some of his comments that are quoted and kind of stand alone in being foolish.
Sure.
I'm not that familiar with him. I would say that I'm assuming he's somewhat of a militant atheist and he's into scientism. Would that be
yeah?
correct
I think that's
assessment?
fair. I think that's
And
fair.
I think that is flowing out. I think that's actually logical positivism for the masses.
Yeah.
And as much as I hate to say it, because David Hume is one of my favorite guys, not because I agree with him, everybody gets that confused. I hate to say that logical positivism is largely grounded in the philosophy of David Hume, in that radical empiricism. The problem is that the logical positivist and folks like the gentleman you're talking about, as well as Richard Dawkins and these various new atheists. That was the thing when I first got into apologetics, right? New atheism. That's just logical positivism for the masses, and they're very dogmatic. They're not taking Hume's entire program into account.
Right.
They don't realize that in accepting his objections to natural religion and natural theology, they're also accepting his radical empiricism and hence his radical skepticism. They won't own up to that. This program of Hume's actually undermines the scientific endeavor that they base their entire lives on. So
yeah, well, that brings us right to the problem of induction, which it's one of my favorite puzzles, favorite problems of philosophy, and specifically because people don't address it. You talk to I work with college students, college athletes, and the dudes in the science, like, hey man, so your professor ever talk about the problem of induction? Anything? What's induction? They don't address it, they don't talk about it, and so I have to teach them in order to show them how flawed it is, and how this problem is a huge problem even today, that most scientists just, it seems from my experience, they just kind of slough it off. Oh, that's for the philosophers. We don't worry about that. We just do the hard science here. Right.
It's very rare to find a scientist who is conversant with the philosophy of science. There was a Christian professor in my undergrad, a professing Christian, who had attended Johns Hopkins and was known as one of the better, I believe her area was chemistry, but I'm not positive on that, but I believe it was chemistry, and she was known for being one of the top professors there in that area, just a scholar. And she actually spent her spare time sitting in with us on our philosophy courses, and I was so impressed by that, because she wanted to know what it was that was underlying the things that she did in the lab, and the mathematics of it, and all of that sort of thing. And so we would come to something like Occam's razor, and she would recognize that she didn't know that as Occam's razor, she knew it as parsimony, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about parsimony in the lab. If you have two competing theories that explain the data equally well, you go with the simpler of the two theories, which, by the way, that's the next paper you need to write, Parker. Since you wrote one on IBE, which I think is very closely related to this inductive problem. We need one on that as well, because Hume called that into question too. Why do we tend to choose the simpler of the two theories? So.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. So in induction, one thing I really wanted to ask you about, and it's a little bit periphery, and feel free to reject, but in answering the problem of induction, I love Van Til. I read most of Van Til's works and rereading them. And what I've seen in Van Til and in a lot of the popular presuppers, we love to just bag on Descartes. And Descartes was, he was the turn towards the self. It was him and his philosophy that started this fall. And when I actually read Descartes myself, I saw him say, if we want to justify our senses, he didn't quite say it in the exact same way that Hume did, or later philosophers talked about the problem of induction, but he raised it in his search for certainty, and he's doubting this and he's doubting that, and then he's doubting his senses, and then he went all the way down to what he thought was ground level, and then justified induction on the way back up. And so he says, cogito ergo sum. I'm the ground of, or I am a thinking substance, and then from there, I see it as a little Van Tilian, and maybe you could disabuse me of that. But he starts with himself, I would say, in Van Tilian terms, as a proximate starting point, and then he uses this ontological argument to show that God's the ultimate starting point. And he even says, if you don't presuppose God, you won't be able to make sense of your senses, something along those lines. And I just wondering what your thoughts are. Like, why do we still hate this dude so much?
Yeah, let me see if I can unpack that some. Well, I think we hate him so much because he basically destroyed Western epistemology. Because we think that if there's not certainty with some knowledge claim,
Mhm.
that we don't have knowledge, and that's not always the case, right?
Yeah.
The discussion of certainty is a whole nother discussion anyway. What are we talking about when we talk about that? Is that epistemic certainty?
Yeah.
Is it maximal epistemic warrant? Is it psychological certainty? Is it a blessed assurance? Jesus is mine. You ask me how I know he lives within my heart. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can
Technically true.
Yeah.
Do you even sing that in Chicago?
No, we don't. In Chicago, we just rap.
Okay.
That's right.
We rap it.
But anyway, it's funny. My ordination service, the music guy asked me, "What do you want sung for your ordination service?" And I said, "What about Be Thou My Vision?" He had never heard of Be Thou My Vision.
What?
Wow. Okay.
No,
So
we do the
know
blues
what I'm
version
gonna
of every song.
Nice.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's unpack Descartes real quick. That's a good point. So first of all, Descartes is a really good illustration of a transcendental argument that's not necessarily the transcendental argument or something like that, right? There's a transcendental direction to his arguments.
Mhm.
So, for example, you might say, how do I know whether or not I exist? Well, if I affirm that I exist, I have to exist to affirm that I exist, and therefore I exist. If I deny that I exist, I have to exist in order to deny that I exist, and so I exist, right? So whether in affirmation or denial, I am actually affirming, or I'm presupposing that I exist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's an instance of a type of transcendental argument. This is the example that Sean Choi uses in his contribution to, I don't remember the name of it. I think it's called Reasons for Faith. But anyway, I think it's edited by Chad Meister. It's been years since I've looked at this. So that's one thing, I think, with what you're saying there. I think there is a transcendental argument. That's a good illustration of a transcendental argument outside of presuppositional literature. Number two, you were talking about, you can't really, you don't know whether or not you can trust your senses and whatnot, apart from assuming that this God exists, presupposing that this God exists. I think that is either a reductio ad absurdum or a transcendental argument of sorts, akin to, I'm being anachronistic here, akin to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. The demon, or whatever that thing is.
Yeah, right.
So the professor who taught me this studied in French, so she would actually use the French terms. But the demon there, in Plantinga's scheme, is the combination of naturalism with evolution. That's the issue. We don't know if we can trust our cognitive faculties, the reliability of our cognitive faculties. And this undermines not only our belief in naturalism and evolution, but every belief that's a deliverance of our cognitive faculties.
Wow.
That's
Chris,
the demon.
Man, I wish I had heard you say that like 2 weeks ago because I did a debate about 2 weeks ago with an atheist, Ken Leonard, and he brought that to me and said, "Hey, how do you know you don't have Descartes' demon, deceiving you about everything?" And I just simply appealed to the Christian worldview as a whole, and I said I sort of pulled an Eli Ayala kind of move, and I said, look, within the Christian worldview system, God reveals Himself and reveals truth to us such that we can be certain of some things. That's not part of my scheme, but thinking about it in the terms that you just mentioned, I wish I had thought about that because you're absolutely right. The evolutionary argument against naturalism is sort of the equivalent of that. There's this demon that could be deceiving you about everything, and that is your unguided evolutionary process. It's an undercutting defeater for all of our beliefs. That's a real challenge to evolutionism. I hadn't plus atheism. I hadn't thought about that. That's very good.
Yeah, I think that's the impetus for. Of course, the argument from reason goes way back. I think it's H.W.B. Joseph is the name of the first account of that argument, a style of that argument that I could find. But Victor,
is he before Balfour? Do you know James Balfour?
I'm not
turn of the century.
I'm not positive. There's something I wrote on this somewhere, but it's been a long time. Because I mean, it remanifests all the time, right? Victor Reppert makes a number of these types of arguments, and C.S. Lewis in Miracles, and I
gotta plug my guy Jim Slagle. It's a crazy expensive book. It's called the Epistemological Skyhook, and actually he traces the history of that, and then develops another like a priori teleological argument.
Well, there you go.
Awesome.
I'll defer to that for sure.
Yeah.
The third thing I wanted to say real quick on Descartes then is the ontological argument. So the Van Tillian criticism of the ontological argument is simply that our concept of God in an autonomous or would-be autonomous sense is not the concept of the revealed God of Scripture through analogy. Does that make sense? So,
is that because of revelation? Is that we have to have this God maybe because of transcendence and incomprehensibility?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Wait. Could you say that again?
So, yes, I was going to. So, if we, I mean, it's a mouthful, right? So,
right.
If and by the way, that's one of the things with presuppositional methodology in particular, but philosophical discourse and apologetics and whatnot. People will say, "Oh, well, this is for people who are in the academy, or this is for people who are smart and all that." No, it's not, and we're all called upon to do apologetics, right? To not only tell people the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for our sins in our place, not only to tell people to believe in Jesus Christ, but also to give a testimony of our own experience of having believed that gospel, and also then to aim to persuade and to, now that's a whole other discussion I'm not going to get into, but I'm saying to offer this often intellectual type account of why we believe what we believe. And we see examples of that in Scripture. So when you're doing that, when you run into these huge terms like I'm using now, because I assume many of our listeners probably read up on these things and listen to these things, but when we're using these big terms, all we have to do—
They will now.
if you don't know what they mean, look them up or ask the person using them, what do you mean by that? Because all these terms they're just fancy words to summarize something that takes a lot longer to say otherwise, right?
Yeah, it's shorthand. Yeah, so you just unpack the shorthand.
So, and I just saw a note that we have to begin to wrap up. So that was probably an hour ago. I don't know. But anyway, so the concept that we have of God in our mind in a would-be autonomous sense. In other words, if we think that we can just think up, okay, here's how I conceive of God, apart from any consideration of how God has revealed himself to me, I run into problems. I'm not going to get, this is what Van Til would say, I'm not going to get to the God of the Bible that way. We are to believe in God, take him on faith, the way that he reveals himself to us by way of analogy. And what I mean by that, again, that is what Parker said. It's the incomprehensibility of God. It's the transcendence of God. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. He is higher than we are. And so it's not that we can't know God. It's simply that we know God through the way that he has revealed himself to us. Now, I got into a discussion with Paul Helm on this point,
Hmm.
and Paul Helm makes the case. He believes that that famous presuppositionalist text, actually in Hebrews, when God swore to Abraham, he swore by himself because there was no one higher by whom he might swear, right? And Paul Helm made the case that that gives us a justification for using an ontological argument because God is the greatest conceivable being.
Hmm. Yeah,
I like it.
I do too. I don't know, Chris. Did you take him to task for that, or what? Did he repent?
Well, we won't talk about all that.
Well,
I secretly love the ontological argument. I love I not I like Anselm's. So in fact I kind of anyway I like
I
Anselm.
think Bonson wants to reinterpret that as a presuppositional way, though. I think he says like
Right.
the modern
Mm-hmm.
planning on. I don't know if he was wrong for planning us or not.
Right.
But
And I mean, that is the faith-seeking understanding tradition. And
Yeah.
when you read Anselm, he's not a dry philosopher. He's doing his devotions.
yeah, he's praying. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, love it. So okay. Before we answer a few questions, by the way, are you okay answering a few of these questions and comments, Chris? Because are
Absolutely.
you okay for time here? All right.
Absolutely.
Can we just do this? Can we just sort of lay out an argument here? Just because we've covered a lot of ground, but why is Christianity, the biblical worldview, the best explanation for why science works or science is possible? And if you could give us like the 1 or 2 minute version of that, I don't know if that's possible, but I'd like to be able to sort of leave our listeners with that nugget, because if they don't understand anything else, I think that would be important for them to get as a takeaway.
Yes. Baptist preachers struggle with brevity, but
Yes. If you could alliterate it too, that'd be good.
I was just thinking that. So science relies upon conceptual tools that are best understood and provided for and accounted for within a Christian worldview, a Christian approach to knowledge, by which I mean we can go with Orthodox Christianity, what's essential to Christianity, the Trinity, the person of Christ, two natures, one person, salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. All of this is intertwined, inextricably intertwined, and related to the essence of Christianity. Of course, Van Til would want to defend Reformed Christianity as the truest expression of what he finds set forth in Scripture, which is the Word of God. But these conceptual tools I'm referring to can include things like the big three: logic, science, of course we'll dig into that, and morality. You need logic in science, right? You don't want to say that something can be the case and not be the case at the same time in the same respect or something to that effect. You need morality in science. You need some sort of meta-ethical theory. You don't want to carry out experiments that violate these ethical guidelines. You don't. It's not okay to just lie in scientific research. These sorts of things. And then we'll dig into science a little bit more here. So you need to be created in such a way that you are at home in the world, so that your senses are generally reliable, so that the conceptions in your mind roughly correspond to the objective material reality around you. These are all things that are necessary in some way to the scientific endeavor. But the one that I really focus on in my book is the principle of induction. It's been called the uniformity of nature. You can call it regularities. I'm not going to argue that point right now. But this is simply the idea that our God is a God who is a God of order. He is a God who wants us to be at home in the world, to be able to come to the knowledge of ourselves, the knowledge of the world, but also the knowledge of Him. And He has, of course, revealed Himself to us in general revelation, in the things around us, in even in ourselves, in the sense that we're created in the image of God, not in the sense that we are divine or something like that, but we're created in the image of God. This world is his revelation to us. And so knowledge is a good thing in the Christian worldview. It's not a bad thing, not a thing to be discouraged. It's a thing to be encouraged because it brings glory to God. And so God has imposed these regularities and imposes these regularities on his creation. And that is what we understand as the laws of science or the laws of nature. This gives us a basis then to make general and particular predictive inferences with regard to the scientific endeavor. This means that when you crack your egg open in the morning to eat breakfast, you get an egg that comes out of there. You don't get a dragon that comes out. We would generally expect an egg to come out of the eggshell, and that's for good reason. It's because this is an orderly world that we were created to exist in.
You know, you are disappointing my 8-year-old son so bad right now because he'll ask me, he's very, very sharp, but he'll ask me questions all the time like, well, Dad, like I could see him literally saying like, Dad, what if a dragon comes out when you crack the egg? He hasn't said that exact thing, but for me it's because that's just not going to happen. Like we just don't live in that kind of world. But now, Chris, now I can go to him and go, listen, son, have you ever heard of regularity or the principle of induction? And you know what? He'll actually understand that because he's always looking for ways to play out the implications of the stuff. When I catechize him in the morning or when we do family devotions at night, he's always looking for the connection points between what we are studying and the real world. So
that's so good.
Yes.
Well, now you can point him to the bad man, Chris Bolt, who destroyed his dreams of dragons.
Son, have you ever heard of Dr. Chris Bolt?
I mean, look, the gospel is what, isn't it that, the Son of God comes and slays the dragon and saves the girl?
Amen.
So there you go.
That's good. That's good. So, is this a good time for us to address a few questions? Are we good to do that?
I'm good for whatever you guys need.
Okay. So I'm gonna scroll through here, man. You got some serious trolling going on, but let's say, now, do you know someone named? I mean, this can't be the person's real name, but Brigand Bladestorm. This isn't even. What is this? What is this? Speaking of dragons, this person. Do you know this person?
That's it. That's my question.
This person is actually a contributor to Choosing Hats.
Okay. So the question is, why does Christian Twitter hate science? More specifically, that's it. That's my question. I don't know what to do with this. Do you know what to do with this, Chris? Is this a real thing?
I don't know what to do with this. It's not really a real thing, other than to say that it does make a good point, which is that people throw this term around science. Well, that's not what the science is saying. Look, science doesn't say anything. What science are you talking about? What method of science are you talking about? Even getting into the methodological question, are we talking about? When we learn the scientific method in elementary school, what you discover in philosophy of science is this is very much an oversimplification of what's going on. And there's been an entire history of the scientific method and how it's developed and whatnot. So,
yeah, no, that's very good. And you even mentioned in your book, don't you, that sometimes people view science almost in an idolatrous way. Nowadays.
Absolutely. And this is a point I was actually discussing with someone fairly recently. I made a point about this and they got upset. So I wrote a private message to clarify. People who push back against whatever may be a popular conclusion in science. And so I'm not getting into any of these debates or taking a position on this. I want to make that clear. But when we get to these topics that are just obscenely controversial, like vaccines versus anti-vaccination, or recently it's the flat earth view, and these sorts of things, oftentimes those who are in the camp that's considered the minority position or the anti-science position are actually using what they deem scientific reasons to bolster their claims. Right? I mean, if you watch television, turn on television, you watch a commercial, it can be a commercial for the silliest thing in the world. It has nothing to do with science. And they will somehow try to appeal to science to make you buy it. Yeah, it is somewhat of an idol in that sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Lucas Giolis says, Sociologist John Evans argues that only academics care about supposed knowledge conflict between science and religion, but the general public only cares about cases of moral conflict. As a pastor, what do you think about that claim?
I think it's a false claim. I mean, just speaking to my experience, but I think that I can speak more generally as well. You at the beginning of this episode, right? We discussed this. When you run into people on the street, they just will assume, for example, that that Christianity is at odds with modern biology and biological evolution and this sort of thing. Which, by the way, that's a whole different discussion. Don't hear me, people, as saying that I'm a theistic evolutionist or something. I'm not. Yeah. But and this can run both ways, right? So you could have the atheist complaining about Christianity, but you can also have the Christian complaining about evolution being taught in the school, right? Or all these things that they're calling science, or they don't know. The doctors don't know. By the way, a lot of times the doctors don't know. No, I don't think that we only care about cases of moral conflict, although I can construe, for example, something like the debate over whether or not evolution should be taught in public schools or whether or not Christianity should be taught in public schools. I can understand that in the sense of a moral conflict, and maybe that's what Evans is talking about.
Park, you good with that?
What? Yeah, do you want me to contradict him?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I was actually going to say we should bring on our surprise guest, Ballant or Ballant. I don't know how to pronounce it, but we could talk conceptual versus world-directed TAs and just. He's not waiting in the wings, but
no.
I talk about it all the time.
Ballant, and I think his last name is pronounced Bakefi.
Okay.
But I'm surprised he's not listening, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. He'll pop into my personal messages later, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. This is an easy one. When are you writing the early high school level version of The World in His Hands?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't. That's funny because I talk to this person almost every day. I haven't given that much thought, but that's a good idea, actually.
You know what? That is a good idea because I am always looking for resources for high school age. I'm actually working on an apologetics curriculum right now for my kids' homeschool co-op for the high schoolers, and there really is a dearth of good presuppositional resources for that age group. I mean, a lot of it is like, the case for Christ for teens and that kind of thing, and very evidential, which, when I was in high school, I loved all that stuff. But, man, Parker, can you imagine if we had been introduced to presup in high school?
That would have been wild. Imagine going through the cage stage in high school.
Oh, dude, can you imagine where we'd be at today?
I wouldn't have finished. That would have been.
Okay.
His concern is almost exactly the same as yours there. What you just said about there just being not very many materials out there for apologetics for younger people.
Yeah.
Presuppositionally, as far as presuppositional materials, there is the Pushing the Antithesis book that has Bonson's name on it, but I actually believe it was written by, was it Gary DeMar? It's based off Bonson's notes. The first two chapters are clearly Bonson, but I think the rest of it is not. And then, I mean, when you listen to enough Bonson, you know if it's Bonson or not. And then the other one would be that book by Pratt, Richard Pratt. What's the name of that?
Every Thought Captive.
Every Thought Captive. Yeah,
that's right.
Mm-hmm. Which is great. I think the last quarter of that book, he lost me. He started getting into all these different examples, and I'm like, okay, but that is a good book. Yeah. What's your next book?
So I'm working on a few different projects, but I think that my next book is probably going to be an introduction to like a philosophical approach to presuppositional apologetics. You get, you can get the more biblically oriented books on presuppositional apologetics. You can get the explanations, right? The methodological type books like the Van Til Reader, Bonson's Vantil's Apologetics. But what you don't find a lot of are books on here is how this method is actually applied in terms of specific arguments and I think I'd like to do that.
Yeah. So next one, do you miss poning atheists on IRC?
No.
That's good. That's a simple one.
IRC, what is that? Something relay chat? What is that?
I'm not even sure what that stands for. But it's an old chat client. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you on the elusive and mythological chat channel for Dr. White at all? Did you ever make
The
that list?
dividing line?
There may have been a time when I was seen there a few
Nice.
times.
That thing is legendary. Once he talked about Dr. Anderson being on there, and it's like, man, there's some legends behind the scene. He'll laugh
Well,
about it here and there.
of course, there's so many things are so crazy right now in evangelicalism, and there's so many politics all over the place. But James R. White has had a significant impact on a lot of people early on in their study of Christian apologetics and theology. So, and that's the same with me. I mean, he's certainly one of the better apologists of our time. So, if not
Definitely.
the best, I think he's got more debates than any other living apologist.
Yeah, it's insane the amount of stuff he puts out.
Yeah.
This next question, this is my next door neighbor, Iljan Cho. He says, how can a Christian be a 6-day creationist yet still agree with science?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but something that goes into a lot of detail to try to answer that, right? So I would say, and this makes some of my friends uncomfortable, but I say that I start with the Word of God on this, right? There is, in my mind, even though I take, I guess you would call it a concordance view, where Scripture and the things we discover through true science, right, through scientific findings in the world, those are never going to ultimately be in conflict with one another, because these are the two great books, right? It's the book of nature, and it's the book of Scripture, and these are not going to be in conflict with one another at the end of the day. And so if I come to the book of Genesis, this is predominantly an exegetical question for me. I
Yes.
don't, and this could get me killed too, I guess, but I don't consider this a matter of essential Christian orthodoxy
How dare you, sir?
per se, but an exegetical question when we look at age of the earth questions in the book of Genesis. I myself hold to what's called a solar day view, which is very similar to the so-called literal 6-day creation view. I used to be a day ager, but I'm not anymore. And the reason why there was, again, it was an exegetical concern. Someone said to me, okay, evening and morning, what is that? And I said, well, that indicates the end of this lengthy period of time. And he said, okay, but in my view, I can talk about an actual evening and morning. You can't do that. This is just like poetic or something. Like there's no filler for this phrase. And that's actually, even though I know there are lots of other arguments on all of this, that was what did it for me. And I thought, you know what, you're right. And I may not know how all of this works out in terms of the age of the earth and scientific findings and whatnot. But I'm going to hold that view and begin to work from that presupposition. And as I've, first of all, this is not that interesting of a question to me. I mean, I'm not talking about that against Mr. Cho here, but it's not that interesting of a question to me in terms of my studies and whatnot. I just don't find it a concern to my faith or the questions that I have about my faith, which is odd because for many people it is. So I haven't studied this a great deal, but what I wanted to say is, as I've studied it more, I've found a lot of very good science that supports this position of a younger universe and whatnot. And I would say that the philosophy of science plays into this as well. Like having a little bit of anti-realism built in is not necessarily a problem when we're approaching some of these questions. But I do see that this is someone who's into biology. And so I would point that person maybe towards some of those in the intelligent design movement and some of their observations about biological life, and the arguments that macroevolutionary biologists talk about, some of those have some bad assumptions behind them that you simply pull the rug out from under it and approach it in that way. So that's a generally unhelpful answer to that question. I apologize.
No.
I'm just not as good on the specifics of that as a biologist would certainly be. So I would point you to other people's works on that, particularly those within the intelligent design movement. I know that they tend toward old Earth creationism, but anyway.
No, it's good, and even what you talk about in your book in terms of natural laws, how the biblical worldview is the best explanation for those anyway. So it really, if the Bible is essential to understanding what's going on in the world and to understanding scientific data, then really the age of the earth does come down to first an exegetical question, a hermeneutical question, and then it's a scientific question, I think.
Yeah, it's
right?
a much softer concern, and this
Mm-hmm.
runs parallel
Mm-hmm.
to evidentialism, right? I mean, it's
Right.
Well, what if we discover the bones of Jesus? Well, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I can tell you for certain that's not going to happen.
Right.
And okay, if you want to look at this story where it seems as though they did discover them, then we'll deal with that on an evidential level.
Mm-hmm.
But understand presuppositionally, in the case of a young Earth or whatever, if Scripture says that there's a 6-day creation, I'm going with that.
Yeah.
Because to reject that is to undermine the entire scientific endeavor. I don't have science in the first place.
Yeah.
That seems like a cop-out, but it's not. It's the grander answer that then sets us up to even be able to talk about these more specific concerns about, age of the Earth and whatnot. Go to Triablog or Triablog.com, I believe. Steve Hayes, he has a lot of articles on this topic as well. He takes the solar day view and interacts with some of the science and the philosophy of science, but so much is determined by the assumptions we start with when we come to a question like that.
Yeah, that's good. And that's TRIABLOGUE.com, I think, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. I think I have let's see, couple more questions here, but really quick, our friend, I don't know how you pronounce this, Team Kozlik?
Taco Slick.
Oh, Team Taco Slick. Oh, okay. He he encouraged Parker and I to be sure to have this famous liberal back on.
Yeah.
So he's really, man.
Apparently it's he's saying this in jest. There are some who actually believe this apparently, and I'm thinking I go around saying that unless you believe in Jesus, you can't know anything, and that makes me a liberal. Okay.
Well, maybe you need to adopt the King James Bible. Maybe that would help. I don't know. Okay, so now here's a comment from someone named Joel Pearson, and I copied it and pasted it in because it was a comment in the Unbelievable group. I have no idea if Joel is still watching. With a name like Joel, I have a hard time thinking he could be, that far off. But the comment actually says otherwise. So here's what he says. He says, well, at least if they start from accepting science, they'll become, this is good. And he's commenting to the very existence of this episode that we're filming right now. He says, well, at least if they start accepting science, they'll become less religious. There have been a lot of lies about Christianity being the source of science rather than what really happened. Christianity set science back by 1,000 years. So I guess my only question for you, Chris, is how can you follow a religion that set science back for 1,000 years?
Well, it doesn't set science back. It actually provides the preconditions for the intelligibility of the scientific endeavor, first and foremost. And if someone wants to explain to me how they answer the concern raised by David Hume and others, such as Bertrand Russell and even into the modern day, as far as how we answer this problem of induction, then be my guest. But I've studied those answers and I find them wanting, and I believe that those who are serious about philosophy of science will likewise find them wanting. Even our modern approach to science through something like a modified Popperian approach or a hypothetical deductivism it sidesteps. Popper's actually brilliant in this sense. He tries to sidestep the problems raised by Hume to say that induction can be used in this broad general sense, not to give us positive knowledge with regard to scientific information, but rather to inform these sweeping conjectures or theories that we might set forth. And then what we do is we go about trying to rigorously test these theories we've come up with to try to refute those theories. And insofar as a theory is tested and is not refuted, it's rational to continue to hold that theory. However, what you understand with this deductive approach is that science is not, in fact, a route to truth at all. We can't have scientific knowledge per se. We simply have these rational theories, or at least we think that they're rational to hold. The difficulty here is that it falls right back into the problem of induction, because when we rigorously test this theory and it succeeds in the lab and it's not refuted, we don't know the very next moment when we're done, we don't know if the situation has changed, because we don't have a uniformity or regularity in nature at that point. And so when you hear people talk about falsifiability and whether or not a theory is falsifiable or can be falsified, this is what they're referring to, whether they know that or not. They're referring to one aspect of Karl Popper's approach to Sir Karl Popper's approach to science. So I'm reminded here when he says this of a comment that Dr. Habermas made once. He said, these students hear these offhand remarks or off-a-cuff remark by a professor at some secular institution, and it destroys what they believe about Christianity, and it's just a just because I say so sort of thing. It's just an assertion. And so what I would say to this person is, first of all, check out my book, because I don't just believe lies I've been told. I don't think you can demonstrate where that may be the case. I don't just believe the lies I've been told about science and where it originated and all of that. I studied under people who did not share my worldview, who were not Christians. I studied under people in the area of religion. I studied under a Muslim. I studied under a person who is a liberal Christian, I mean, in the truest sense. I studied under another person who considered themselves a progressive, a Talikian. I studied under atheists, people who took an atheistic approach to these questions. And, it's always funny to me that on the street, as it were, you encounter these folks who are skeptics, and they automatically assume that you're an idiot and that you haven't looked into these things on your own and that you're incapable of intelligible thought on your own. And I simply want to say, what else do you want me to do? I took a dive into the best that your understanding of the world has to offer. And I found that your problem is not that you're a skeptic. Your problem is that you're not skeptical enough. And so you can't see that everything you do, whether it's logic, science, morality, everything you do on a day-to-day basis, plus when we get into academic discussions, it's all premised upon this suppressed truth that that the God of the Bible exists.
That's
Yeah.
good.
Amen, man. That's awesome. I love that, and that's why I love studying the problems of philosophy. And I think for the most part, there's a couple like qualia and stuff that's kind of tricky, but these problems arise because you stepped off the Christian worldview.
That's
And you have
exactly
to
right.
you have to tacitly presuppose the Christian worldview as you're walking down the street, or as you're cracking your egg, or as you're putting your toothpaste on your toothbrush.
Yeah.
You're tacitly presupposing what you explicitly deny in the classroom, and when you're yelling at me for being a country bumpkin, for believing in Christianity.
Yeah. So we did get this comment here from Ballant.
Hey, there he is.
Hey, Keffy. He said he's listening. So
He's awake.
you also we can't address all these. Look, Aris Hampton says, Dr. Bolt, what is the smallest seed? Brian Forbes says he'd also like Dr. Bolt to go on record as to what the smallest seed is. Man, you're getting trolled real hard. We got this is the Kraken. This is someone from another podcast that I used to be on. Yeah. Can we go? Can we get for the record that turning your hair pink is not a sin as a man? read my book is a logical argument. All right, this is devolving into
This
just
is pure trollery.
it's pure trollery. We did get one more question from Lucas Giolis again. What are pastors doing wrong when it comes to addressing science or not addressing science? Okay, I'm going to answer this one because we have to wrap up.
Yes.
Read this book.
Yeah.
Read Chris Bolt's book. Give this to your pastor, and this is a great starting point. I would also say, oh man, that other book by Dan Ray. I had Dan Ray on to talk about his book. Dan Ray and Paul Gould. They co-edited a book called "It's How the
Cosmos,
Heavens."
right? Something about the cosmos.
It's like yeah, man. Now
You
that
should know this, dude. You're failing.
I know. I'm totally failing, but anyway, look up Dan Ray and Paul Gould's book about how the heavens declare the glory of God. Amazing, amazing book. But there are books out there that you can give to your pastor, and whether your pastor is going to take that and run with it, that's a whole nother story. But that's where prayer comes in, and gentle, respectful encouragement. And you know what? Maybe it's up to you or someone else who's like-minded to start a ministry, an apologetics science-based ministry. Just make sure that it's presuppositional, Lucas, because we want to be thoroughly biblical. Lucas is he's not going to like that I said that. But real quick, Chris, where can folks, other than buying this book, which we recommend everybody does, where can they interact with your thinking?
You can follow me on Twitter at CLBolt, but that gets a little bit scary. You can look at some of the things I wrote in my Cage Stage days at Choosing Hats. There are links to archives there, recommended reading lists. And it's not just me at that site writing either. There are debates out there as well. Some people have put some of those debates on YouTube, I believe. And then, of course, there's this book here, and hopefully some more books in the future. Also, make sure to check out my interview with Eli Ayala, and check out the other things he's doing. He's doing a great job, and these guys here, likewise, are doing some really good stuff. And the mustard seed is not the smallest seed of all in the entire world, but Jesus was accommodating things to his audience there who understood a mustard seed and not the seed that was in a completely different part of the world that they had never experienced.
Amen. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much. Just want to encourage everyone watching or listening. If you are listening on the podcast, please give us an honest 5-star rating and review. If you're wondering, well, what is the name of this podcast? Is it Sons of Thunder? Is it the Think Podcast? On Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or whatever your favorite app is, we are the Think Podcast with Joel Settecase, presented by the Think.Institute. We've got a different kind of episode every single day of the week. And on Thursdays, we do Thunder Thursdays with the Sons of Thunder. That's my brother Parker and me. We are in the middle of a series right now going through Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, which is a book that we recommend you read along with us, and then tune in next week as Parker and I tackle rule number 3. You can follow the Think Institute on Twitter. It's at ThinkInst, or on Facebook and Instagram at the Think Institute. You can get more amazing content from Parker simply by going to Parker Settecase, SETTECASE.com. And I'm on all the socials as well. So Dr. Bolt, Chris, thank you again for joining us. Parker, thank you for being my guest on my podcast.
Yeah, great.
And, until next time, that's all we have for you. So until next time, we hope that this
bolted you down. Bolted you down in your
yeah,
convictions.
that's good. I'll go with that. All right.